Welcome back, friends and scoundrels. I am Bran,
And I'm Lynn.
and this is some podcast that doesn't have a name yet because we're still workshopping it.
Still a mouthful.
I know, but I got the correct words that I wanted into at that time on our second attempt at recording this.
Second attempt and still no name.
But it just we kind of decided on the last part of this to try to throw a name out. Took us what, half hour, 45, maybe an hour
Yeah.
to do that, and just in case you didn't pick up on that, we have decided to do a part two for Pleasantville because there's just too much and I don't know where to begin writing or how to write on any of that at the moment. This is the most convenient thing to do, at least for me.
Yeah, for you. I'm sitting here not liking the fact that you've got, 3 pages of notes?
I have 2 pages of notes and
Front, back.
yeah. But the first page is all the stuff that we talked about last time. But it, like I ended that episode with, just way too much. So
If we must.
we must, even though the points don't matter. So, man, it's always hard getting started with these things, especially when you just have a jumble.
I thought you were clarifying your jumble so we could start better. Of course, why would you?
So, I mentioned last episode, I listened to a podcast from the Tom Wood Show where he had Carl Benjamin on, and it was just interesting how so many things at the time lined up and just made me think about this movie and put a lot of things into perspective. And one of those things was the morals that you're raised on. And how Tom was talking about the older folks at Latin Mass and how he felt bad for them because they're having to experience such drastic changes in their life that they just kind of don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah.
And how he didn't feel bad for the younger folks, younger being middle age or maybe a little bit younger.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for that him and Carl get into is that those people not only allowed for those changes to happen, but they're actively engaged in enabling it and causing these changes to happen. Or in the most sympathetic light, they're standing by while these changes happen. And a little part of that is because we're raised on, because of the morals that we're raised on, so they're constantly shifting and changing from generation to generation. And as this movie takes time to point out, it's younger folks who are often causing those changes to occur and forcing it to happen in a way.
Yeah.
And over time, certain things can be devalued or revalued and or diluted. It's that way the original intent of it is lost, kind of like with the traditions.
Yeah.
I think we got into a little bit.
It's because no one wants to be like their parents' generation. Every generation thinks they are and can do better. And you can lose some of the good in that too.
And it depends on what you're doing those things for. So,
Pure obstinance.
well, and this is one of the trade-offs with liberalism as a philosophy and as a political structure, is that you do lose sight of those traditions and the importance of those traditions. And even though you don't, where was I going? That it's important to hold to the spirit of the traditions more so than it is to rigidly adhere to what the tradition is. So Tor is a good example of that. How many things are there that, one, are just completely irrelevant today, but the underlying principles and values of those traditions are important because Tor is supposed to be there to help us understand how to be a good person. But not just that, there's a lot of value in what it means as a society.
Yeah.
And how to function as a good society where we do allow people their individuality and, to most degrees, some liberalism. But we have this underlying current of what our society is that maintains us. Back to the social contract, darn it. Back to the social contract conversation of how fragile that can be. And especially when you start getting this extended society that doesn't have any glue to hold itself together.
Yeah.
And then another program I was listening to is this Mark Anderson gentleman on Joe Rogan. And this was shortly after or right around the election of 2024.
Yeah.
And they got into talking about how values change or how they have changed and why they've changed with certain groups. So a lot of, I'll say far left leaning communities that generally tend towards socialism and this communalism aspect. He pulled up this term from Nietzsche, which I think it was Nietzsche, which is resentimentism.
Yeah.
And it falls into this trap of negative values being seen as equivalent to good values or positive values. And not just that, but subverting them and taking their place. So,
How do you mean?
well, for a long time, through our history, we valued hard work and, doing what you need to do for yourself and to provide for your community and your society. But through this resentimentism, hard work is looked down upon. We do see that now.
Yeah.
I mean, some people say pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and then people who want socialism will argue that it's racist and bad and that you shouldn't because the government's there to take care of you. So
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like that post I read to you the other day. The one side wants you to work uh 14 hours a day and then come home and work and clean and cook there and not get any sleep and have all the stress and anxiety, and then the other side just wants to float on an island somewhere and points out how it's the first one is wrong and that we should all want to just float on the island somewhere, which fine, everybody likes to relax, but if everyone's floating on an island somewhere not doing anything, where do you think everything is coming from?
yeah, just the basic principles of life.
Where's food coming from if nobody works?
Well, those basic principles of life require work.
Yes.
The hierarchy of needs, I think it's Asloff, where water, shelter, food, community. That off the top of my head, I think that's kind of the order. But you can't, water isn't just there for, I think it goes to show how we take things for granted and we don't actually understand what's going on in our processes. That sentiment.
Yeah, well, exactly. Because, in this scenario, if you're just sitting around doing nothing or relaxing, whatever it is you're sitting around doing, what makes you better than the people who need to work in the water? Because somebody's got to do that. Someone has to make the food.
Well, even
it has to be farmed.
We're going to do away with all these institutions that provide us these means of comfort that we take for granted.
Yeah.
Without those things, you have to do for yourself. So you have to walk down to the stream. You have to walk out to your well and get the water yourself. It's not just there. You need food. You either have to learn how to grow it, which means you have to go outside and get dirty and do this work yourself, or you have to go find it, which is a lot of work, and oftentimes, as I'm learning, a lot more work.
It is.
But your house, all these things, you either have to go find a hole in the ground that's suitable for you, or build a house. It really shows that, and it really shows how people take this for granted. But not just that, how this elitist mentality that some people are better than others and shouldn't have to do anything, and other people are still going to be required to work. And you're really creating a system of slavery through that.
Well, you are, because I've seen the same post by this same group talking about relief that there's now someone to shop for you so you don't have to go to the grocery store. Why can't there be someone to work for you? Well, that someone who's shopping for you is working.
And working for you.
And working for you. And if someone did your job for you, if you got paid to do nothing, you now have other people doing things for you It's exactly what you said. It's slavery. Some people get to do nothing and others have to keep working because people have to keep working. The grocery store doesn't stock itself. Food isn't brought into the grocery store on its own. Even just ordering stuff on Amazon. Robots aren't driving it for everybody to their door and delivering it.
Right, well, and then brings to the next point of if everybody gets to not work, well, now you just create a robot class, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I don't want that. Not because of the general fears that we see perpetrated through other movies that we'll probably explore later, but because it's not a fulfilling life. That's not fun. Like, there's nothing to that life.
Yeah.
Work gives us purpose and meaning.
Well, it does. It's the saying is the best things in life
Are free.
things. No. I've heard that one too, but the things you work for. Let me actually get to the right one.
I don't know offhand. It's not coming to me.
Well,
The best things in life are worth doing.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Something like that.
It's some saying about how you find actual
are the things you get most satisfaction from.
Most of the time.
Most of the time.
Again, there has to be that sense of meaning and purpose behind it. Because you're not going to get a lot of satisfaction out of going and just digging a hole. Unless you love digging. Unless you're a dog. Or a pig.
I'm sure there are people who like to dig holes. I think I may have completely lost what you were originally talking about.
we did get off track from the morals that we're raised on.
We're talking.
Yeah.
Okay.
But not completely, because there was value and moral talk in there. But we were using that to make the point of how over time we've lost this concept of work.
Yeah.
And what it actually means, that it's not just this thing that we do to produce goods and services for people so that people can consume things or be consumers.
Yeah.
The main point of doing things is to provide good and services for people, but the underlying point of that is to produce things and to help people with things that they need, as opposed to like how many things exist now that we're just made. The fidget gadgets are a fantastic example.
The fidget gadgets?
Of that.
Yeah.
Well, there's this thing that people are making and they try to give scientific backing behind it, but you can always find something to fidget with if you're a person that needs something to fidget with, and the people who need things to fidget with often aren't using the fidget devices.
Right.
How many times can you say fidget?
I think I've only said it once, so I win.
But
they're
this mindless thing that we're convinced that we need that don't serve any real purpose, or at least the intended purpose. I've seen some of the things like the poppy tray things.
Yeah.
Like they're shaped like animals or whatever, and they've got the little bubbles.
Poppers.
I've actually seen in the miniature hobby space a lot of people take those and use them as a paint palette because they're often made out of silicone and you pop them out easy. So people found a use for it, but the original intention of it was just mindless consumerism.
My concern was against them and getting them for the kids is that it would create the need to fidget.
Develop a habit.
Yes, because it would develop a habit that would then become a need to fidget. And they're kind of just toys for direct distraction in school, but then you start to convince yourself that you need your fidget because it's helping you with a problem you don't actually have, because it's really just
it's creating a problem to fix the problem.
It's creating a problem. Is my concern with them. Again, I feel like I got up.
That one was a weird tangent. I'll give you that one.
Not doing very good.
But today. To the original point of back to one of the starting points of how the youth guide these changes, there is some value in that because they're young, they see things in a new light, but we haven't done a very good job of helping them to understand why we do these things, why we have these rules, why we have these morals and values.
Okay, Peter.
I'm a fuddy-duddy, thank you very much. But that's one of the points of why we don't allow children to make decisions. also. Because they don't have any deeper understanding or experience in the world to know what the long-term consequences are going to be.
Yeah.
Which is one of the fun points of this movie, is that nobody's considering what the long-term consequences of this could be. We're doing it just for the sake of doing it. It's progress for the sake of progress, without any consideration of where that progress is going and like what the effects are going to be on people. So something that I didn't consider at all until one day. I don't even remember how it popped into my head, but what is Bud's life like when he comes back? It was like David goes back to the real world, and the assumption is that this world stays the same.
Yes, because
Jennifer stays.
Jennifer stays. So this assumption is that this world is real and it stays the same.
So what happens with Bud? Does he come back and he's not uncolorized again?
Well, I would think he would have to be because he didn't go through the growth. So now
He didn't
he's
go through the transformation. Or does he just pop back and go, "What is this?" Because gotta look back at this. Is that he was fighting with his sister, and David took over his body. So, like, the whole existential questioning of this is a whole other thing to get into, and I don't know if I'm capable of doing that. But
I think Jennifer's is worse though because she just straight up jacks Mary Sue's body.
Yeah.
Because we are under the assumption these are real people.
Or they become real at any rate.
Or they become real at any rate, yes.
So Bud comes back and his entire world is just gone. For all intents and purposes, it's just gone. Nothing exists anymore, at least the way he knew it. And like, how do you come back suddenly from nowhere and deal with that?
I think it's similar to a Captain America scenario. I mean, they don't actually show it in the movies because they can't, or anything. But he just 1 minute you're crashing a plane, and the next you're in Times Square because that's where he bursts out and runs into, which is just it's on the same extreme level as going from black and white to in color from the 40s.
It really is.
It's what it's. I've gone off again. I'm not doing very good today. It's my going off today.
We're going off.
Move along.
You know what's sad about this is I had a good transition into progress for progress sake. I did it fairly well and just completely broke it. But that's where we were going next. Because there was a bit of that I noticed with this where this is just change for the sake of change.
Yeah.
With no concept. And I think we might have got into this a little bit in the previous episode, but we're going to take some time to actually talk about that a little bit right now. Because progress and progressivism is something that we do hear a lot in our current environment, the society in America and the Western world kind of as a whole. I can't speak to other cultures, but I do get a decent bit of insight from other places like Canada and England and France and Germany a little bit, because they're all part of the Western world and we all think that we have rights to control each other.
Yeah.
And a lot of these people call themselves progressives that are pushing for a lot of things that really don't seem to actually be helpful. And it just begs the question of what progress is. What do we mean when we say progress? Because when I think of progress, I think of moving in a positive direction that helps everybody and is beneficial to everybody in our society and helps us be stronger and better together. There's a lot of other people, when they say progress, they mean pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable. Maybe. Yeah. I think that would be a reasonable definition of it. And there's some value to that to a certain degree. Like, something semi-relevant to this movie is the civil rights movement, because we see allusions to that in certain imagery and the way certain things are handled, where there were some really bad laws and just general societal ideas that have been around for all of our existence, realistically, that needed to be re-examined and changed. And to bring it more to the present, where you have a similar thing, but maybe isn't quite as beneficial, is marriage.
Hmm.
So, for clarity reasons, I don't think the government should be involved in marriage, no matter who it is. And this is still relevant to racism, too, because there were laws that, oh my goodness, because there were laws where people of different skin color or ethnicities or whatever couldn't marry.
Yeah.
And through that, we're able to create all these other terrible laws. Like those laws needing to be pushed away are a good thing. Because again, I don't think, other than as a greater witness to what you're doing, government has no business being involved in that.
I agree. Government has no place in marriage.
And that witnessing can take the shape in the form of a notary just being an official person who says, yep, I acknowledge that these two people are what they say they are, and that whatever that entails shall be entailed.
Just for tax purposes.
Tax purposes or whatever, power of attorney esque
Yeah.
situations, medical needs, whatever. Have a present. But to take that further, where we're saying that same sex marriage is perfectly fine and to the morals, where that's being used as no, this is a normal thing and we should push and advocate for people to be like that. And the part of relationships that is actually biologically normal, which is the heterosexual position, that is now the bad thing. That needs to be pushed away because this little tiny group of people has been marginalized and treated badly.
That doesn't mean you have to marginalize and treat poorly the other side.
No, and that's where this progress for the sake of progress comes in, and where we need to draw the line on what progress is. And through this too, the queer community activism and progress through that helped me to understand what a lot of other people mean by progress, from looking at it through the historical lens and politically, because you have a lot of politicians. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive, quote unquote, and a nephew or grandson or whoever.
Yeah.
FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Wilson. A lot of these people were also progressives. And in that sense, what I've come to understand progress in that position meaning is growth of government power, because that's what all of these people stood for. They all wanted the scope and size of government to grow so that way they could oversee things such as marriage.
Yeah.
But it's just like a lot of the things that people are struggling with now that they recognize as being major issues know that it comes from the government and they're frustrated by these things. And a lot of those policies come directly from FDR.
Do you have a for instance?
The subsidies for farmers is a huge issue in America and it just in the world at large. But
farmers depend on those.
Yeah, it's created this welfare state within itself where farmers are not just the subsidies part, but when in order to help people make more money, one of the policies out of I think it was the NRA was the acronym for it. I don't remember exactly what it stood for, but it wasn't National Rifle Association. Terrible. But but one of the policies from that was that like pig farmers had to wholesale slaughter pigs.
Yeah.
And the whole point of it was to drive the price of pigs up so that way they can make more money. But that failed because now we have less pigs to feed people.
Right.
And so that created a whole new set of problems. But then created this, it didn't help with these people making money either, because people who needed to buy pigs, one, there wasn't enough for them to buy. Two, they still didn't have money to buy pigs. So it created this situation of needing to subsidize. And the government out of Washington, D.C., informing what people are allowed to grow. And that So being in Nebraska in the plains where it's dry a lot of the time, that's part of how we got into growing these crops that require enormous amounts of water that has its own level of consequences on the environment, where I think some people are starting to look at the deeper ground
Yeah.
implications and
Yeah.
the erosion underground that might be happening with that. But also, just that aside, whether that's true or not, I see it every day driving around. A lot of the creeks and rivers and similar bodies of water that just a lot of them just don't exist. Or
Because they're being drained to water the fields because some entity in Washington, D.C. decided that we need to grow this crop that isn't suited to our environment.
no, and the North Platte seems okay around here, our river, but you saw it a couple years ago. You go a little bit east, and it's like all but dried up
Yeah.
in some areas. Which, like the implications that that's having on nature, and how that could be contributing to the overall climate in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But it's for a lot of the politicians or politically motivated people that have used the term progress, that's what they've meant over time, is not helping society be better, or they're just generally helping society to be better, helping us to be better, to be able to fulfill the ideals of America and what our country was founded on. It's about growing power, because a lot of these people were also huge fans of the fascists and communists and socialists that just ridiculously terrible policies.
Yeah.
So then the other part of this too is how, and I think we kind of vaguely touched to this point a little bit, is how a lot of this progress and change in this movie come at the behest of Jennifer's selfish actions.
Yeah.
That, yeah, she's changing the society, but she's not doing it with any actual intent. And it's a product of her own selfish decisions
Yeah.
and what she wants, which touches back to why we don't let children vote and why we don't let them make major decisions,
Major life decisions.
major life decisions, or even small ones like getting a tattoo. Especially now, there's not a whole lot of issue with it per se, but it's still this huge decision that you're gonna have to, for most people, are gonna have to live with for all of their life.
Yeah.
And it, while those societal consequences are lessened somewhat for the better, it's still there. Those consequences do still hold true in some places. You know, there are places where you have to look particularly professional, and having a bunch of tattoos aren't viewed in as being a professional thing. Or, and depending on your tattoos, might, if they're inappropriate, might exclude you from something that you really have a passion for doing, like being a child's librarian. And it is just funny to me too, to keep it in the realm of movies, when you look at especially like the late 80s 90s era of Disney princesses who all had an impact on their society.
Yeah.
And it is funny because some of them are doing it for selfish reasons. Actually, I would say almost all of them are doing it for selfish reasons. You know, Ariel and Jasmine and Pocahontas, because
Just trying to think Pocahontas if it was a selfish reason. But go on.
and I did say most of them. I think she was my minor exception. That, but it is actual. Jasmine is a little bit easier to get into this with because there's a little bit of selfishness in her, but also the society that kind of needs to change.
Yeah.
So that way they can move forward. Ariel's a little bit more selfish because she just wants to be an explorer, but she is being repressed by her father and kind of society in general.
Well, yes, but Triton sees the dangers that she doesn't, as you were just saying about children making major life decisions. She got lucky. She found a nice guy.
Right?
She honestly got lucky.
Well,
if we're talking about the real story, it goes bad. Not
the
Disney.
the Disney one, we'll keep it within the realm of Disney.
Fair enough. But as you said, Triton sees the dangers, she doesn't, and they do pose a danger.
A significant one. He knows firsthand that's how her mother died.
Especially if you just consider the long-term implications of what Ariel has done and the impact it's going to have on the fishing town she is now the queen of.
This is not where I intended for this to go when I originally had the idea.
I've gone off again,
but
haven't I?
No, you're using an example as a tangent as an example, whichever. It's relevant to what we're talking about. As opposed to Pocahontas, who there is minor selfishness to it because she does have feelings for John Smith. Ultimately the bad one, not the good one. Not the ultimately good one.
Not the better one.
Yeah, better.
The less bad?
Might be better.
Anyway.
Is it, the changes that come from what she does aren't about her selfishness, it's about preventing a war.
Yeah.
And helping, and a lot of times racism is really big in these too, if you pay enough attention to it. Anyways, I said that's not where I intended that to go originally. I was thinking of the Disney princesses in much different light.
Well,
originally.
I was on your point with children don't realize the consequences of things. Triton and Ariel are a good example of that. It worked out, but we don't get to further into how either now she's
the long-term implications of what happens.
Change her morals and be okay with the fact that all her fishy friends are the main export of her town, or she's gonna have to change that.
Which gonna devastate that town, and
yes,
unless they become importers of other things. But then again, this is also their food supply.
We've all now I've gone off.
Now we've pushed the boundaries of going off.
Yes, did it.
I'm just trying to figure out where I want to go next. We talked about that. Another interesting perspective on this, and this is something I definitely mentioned as something that we didn't get a chance to talk to, and more of this progress for the sake of progress. Another point on the progress for the sake of progress, because this movie came out in 1998, so 9/11 hadn't happened yet.
Yeah.
And the nation building experiment that we went on, that we engaged in afterwards, there's some speculation, maybe even some light evidence that there was a plan for this already, and we had already been involved in the Middle East since 1953. I don't think that's a part that a whole lot of people know. And we were even doing nation building back then to get people in line with what we want, because 1953, Iran, which is an interesting one. We're gonna keep down this path here for a sec. In 1953, Iran was wanting to nationalize their oil industry, and at the time, BP, British Petroleum, had a large stock of it, and Iran was seeking to push them out. And why this is particularly interesting bit here is because for a little while, several years ago, I saw these posts of Afghanistan, 1940s, 1950s, very liberal seeming society. Women were very westernized in their dress, and they had very westernized cultures.
Yeah.
And a few of these areas, Iran, well, I don't know if Afghanistan would have necessarily, but some of these areas were very westernized, and pictures very similar to ours at the time. And then there was this reverse transition from what we see in the movie, where they become more fundamental, more religious zealotry, and how we get to what we see now, where women are in burqas and Birkenstocks. No. They might still wear them. The burqas and the saris. I don't know why I went to Birkenstocks. That's weird.
Saris are India.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know all the correct terms, but I know what I'm talking about. But the saris and the full, I mean, some of them are pretty radical with it, where you can barely even see their eyes in some instances. And some of the cultures that just have to be covered, but their face can still be exposed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just interesting, like, and it got me questioning, like, what happened? Why did that happen? Well, it comes down to 1953 in Iran, where BP owned the oil for all intents and purposes. Iran was like, no, that's ours. We should be benefiting from it, not you. Just fair.
Right.
And so BP and the British government came to the United States and said, hey, fix this for us. So we sent the CIA in to create a coup, to install a fundamentalist dictator who was in line with working with the Western countries and selling off their national interests. And this is just the story that we keep seeing happen from that time on until we get into the modern day. And recently, this finally found fruition in Syria, where Bashar al Assad was overthrown. And I think he was just run out of the country, but I'm not sure. I never followed up on it. But I also didn't hear anybody talk about him being assassinated. Of our nation building and the United States and Western entities going into these areas and imposing our will and trying to change their culture because we think it should happen. And there's some other underlying reasons for doing it too. Oil, heroin.
Zoe, why is it always you two? Couldn't have named a third.
Sand? Glass?
Anyway.
You want a legitimate third, the weapon, the war industry, and all these political and private figures that are getting stupidly wealthy off of wholesale murder is another big one. That's a lot of what's going on in Ukraine right now because we figured out that we don't have to actually send our own people. We can convince other people to fight and we'll sell them weapons. The whole Lord of Wars situation. But it's imposing our will on other people, whether they want it or not, is the whole something that I found interesting with this movie.
Yeah.
That relates to much more terrible things in real life. That might be all that I have on that. And then specifically to get into these changes that are happening with people, a bit that I noticed is everyone in this movie changes, but in very different ways.
Yeah.
So we see these people who are becoming colorized, they change in appearance, and to a minor degree, some of their ideas and values are changing, but overall they maintain their, if you will, pleasant demeanor.
Yeah.
And they're not seeking to hurt anybody or cause any harm. It's just things are changing, and we're changing with it, and we're growing. Right? They're becoming better versions of themselves.
Yeah.
Whereas on the other side, you see the non-colorized folks, they maintain their visual appearance, but their demeanor and attitude changes and they become very aggressive and violent and
start doing very unpleasant
things. And then these are the same folks that implement these rules that are very much in line with like Jim Crow laws and a lot of other similar type of things, rules for thee but not for me.
Yeah.
Because they say, rule number 1, all public disruption and acts of vandalism are to cease immediately. And we see both sides doing that, but they only mean it for one side.
Yeah.
Because they're creating this unpleasant environment, if you will.
No, they mean it for the black and white side. Because he says that in the beginning, before they start reading that, he says, this response, it isn't pleasant. We shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be because he specifically talks about destroying the soda shops.
Oh, that's true.
Be doing that.
That's true. Okay, I'll concede.
That's right, you'll concede because you're wrong.
I forgot.
To victory goes the me.
But to my point, a lot of times and there are some of the other rules, but a lot of times in reality, in real life, not even their reality, our reality, these laws are oftentimes put in place, or laws like these are oftentimes put in place to control a population and to keep certain people from doing things, but not other people.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you, you can't own, buy, or sell umbrellas.
Yeah.
You can have umbrellas.
But it's just a ridiculous law.
It is.
Because rain's a thing that's going to happen now. So you're subjecting your people to potential harm, which rain's one thing, but
Or you can't use these color paints.
yeah.
Obviously, the mayor's side, they're not going to use those paints anyway. The law doesn't affect them.
And the classes and the books, because you were kind of talking about this off air a little bit while we were taking a minor break, that the books in a form technically existed because of bindings and they had the titles,
Yes.
but there isn't any actual material in them.
So there was a vague technical understanding that they were there and what they were.
Yes. But you would have to also assume that the books about Pleasantville and related topics should have words.
Yes.
And one of our favorite things that we like to quote at our kids is when laws aren't just, it's your duty to break them. That's very loose paraphrasing.
Yes.
I was hoping you would have it be able to recall it better.
When a law is unjust, it is your obligation to disobey.
I wasn't far off.
No. I had another little point I think about the laws thing, because there was one particular that I was thinking of when he talks about teaching that they were only going to teach pre-coloring history, pre-colorization history. I forget.
Non-changeist view of history.
Yeah, the non-changeist view of history, because you see that now in things that are taught at school, that one entity is deciding what is being taught.
And it's been that way for a long time, but a lot of that is coming to light.
Yes.
And that's probably one of the very few good things to come out of the COVID lockdowns is parents were there to see what was being taught in schools.
Yes, because it's like teaching. You can teach abstinence only, or you can't teach anything at all, depending on where you are, and or you can teach evolution only.
Or to the point of history, where a lot of places are implementing a revisionist view of history where and there were some terrible evils done throughout history, everybody, but there's an emphasis now on only certain groups of people and the evils that they did, and a lot of that seems like it's just there to badger people and make them feel guilty without any idea of what a recourse might look like, even though they're calling for recourse.
Yes, I don't like the Holocaust denier history. I don't like that the history our kids are being taught is different than the history we were being taught, which, granted, our history wasn't correct either.
And there is a difference between history before and history later, where there's a better understanding of what happened in history.
Yes. That's not necessarily the case of what's happening. Like in the case of your daughter, where The Patriot was shown as a historically accurate movie.
Even though there were a lot of creative liberties taken with that.
Many creative liberties taken.
On some understandable points of where you see in these a lot of times is characters being mashed into one person for simplicity's sake. But then you have some more egregious ones where characters are changed entirely for the sake of drama or whatever, or to get certain points across. But even some historical points in that movie are changed completely, like events and other related things.
But that's a whole nother story on my problem with the school system.
Yeah. And we see them go, I don't care about your rules. We're going to break them because these are unjust laws.
Yes.
And this also comes to another point of why we don't craft legislation during times of high emotions. Because you're 1,000 times more likely to create a bad law or to
create reactionary legislation,
to make a law that might at first, while people have an understanding of what it is, to be and do good, but can over time, as that intention or as even bad actors come into play,
like the Patriot Act.
Yeah, that they can change and manipulate laws. Um, I don't know if there's any better examples offhand, because the Patriot Act was a reactionary legislation and came with a lot of negative stuff
Yes.
and a lot of pointless, unhelpful things. And it isn't kind of in our nature that when something happens, we do tend to 180-degree shift rather than just a 5 or 10% shift, 5 or 10% degree shift, which is usually what we need. I see this all the time in my own job with the people in charge. A little thing happens and it's not enough to just address that thing that happened with that person. We have to create an entire new policy throughout the company that affects everybody and affects them in very negative ways. Or I'm in a bad mood and a whole bunch of bad things are happening and I don't know what the actual problem is, so I'm just going to do a bunch of dumb things. Sorry, that's me ranting for a second. But, oh, what's a really good example?
I don't know. The Patriot Act was the only one I could think of.
Well, a specific law. So I've got a couple of examples. One of them being gun legislation. So it's been more difficult in the United States because we have this stupid piece of paper that people still adhere to versus other countries that, and I'm saying that tongue in cheek because there's a lot of libertarian types that I follow that don't give two squats about the paper of the Constitution.
Yeah.
Even though, how much worse would our country be if we didn't have it on paper? But because we have that in the United States, it does make it a lot more difficult for reactionary legislation to be passed. Versus Australia is a really good example because more people are familiar with it, where they passed this essentially gun ban and buyback program that, yes, it had the effect of reducing gun violence, and so it fulfilled that purpose, but overall violence wasn't affected by it. You didn't treat the actual issue of what was going on here. And immediately afterwards, particularly, you saw a rise in other types of heinous violence with other implements of destruction.
Yeah.
Or tools that could be used for destruction, like knives, hammers, bats, hands, feet, fists.
Fisticuffs.
Where those things rose. And part of it is because bad people are still going to do bad things. Two, you can have this additional rise in those things because people who were capable of defending themselves before are now a lot less capable of defending themselves.
Yes.
One of Nick Freitas's examples that he likes to use a lot is a domestic violence situation where women are prevented from getting guns. So now their boyfriend comes home and beats them to death and they have no means of defending themselves. So, yes, on one hand, your gun violence stat looks better, but you have an innocent dead versus a bad person.
Yeah.
And then the other one that I had are hate speech laws and hate crime laws, where a lot of times those are additional charges on top of things, but they're also often worded as vaguely as reasonably allowable. So that way they can be reinterpreted over and over and over again. And especially with hate speech stuff, the people who generally okay with it when it's implemented would not be okay with the other political side being able to define what constitutes as hate speech.
Yeah.
And that gives license for bad people to do bad things. You just end up with this slope that's rather slippery of negativity.
Yeah.
Regression, if you will.
Always a pretty good indicator of if something's a bad law is if you wouldn't want the other side to be able to use it against you.
Yeah. Do you want your enemy to have this power?
Yes.
Or your political opponent to be less strong about it?
Yeah, let's try not to be enemies here. That doesn't help. You have 10 minutes. Pick your winners.
I suppose the other thing that we can get into that is a lot more relevant and not as crossovery is I kind of thought about this movie a little bit before I watched it, or in thinking about it. My original intention was just to talk about the sex and the enlightenment aspect of it,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't realize how relevant it would be to current times. And one of the other ways, because we covered a lot of that already,
We did.
one of the other ways is the
No.
how people have had this sense of something being wrong, but not quite being able to articulate what that is,
Yeah.
and that things need to change. And a lot of it is in relation to this movie, as we've hit on time and time and time again, that this progress and change for the sake of such, and it happening at the whim and the will of people who don't care to consider what the consequences are.
Yeah.
And people wanting to come back and make a change. And we need to be careful with it, though. I meant to make this point earlier with the laws is that if you do extreme things, you should expect an extreme reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And often for some of this stuff that we'll talk about over the course of the career of this, hopefully, you get into people like Saul Alinsky who wrote Rules for Radicals, and that's the point. Is to do an extreme thing to get an extreme reaction, so that way you can react to that reaction and craft reactionary legislation.
Avalanche.
How many times am I going to do that?
I don't.
But it's become quite fun for me.
As long as you're having fun.
I am Ace Ventura after all. uh, but we're coming into this phase of we're going to start making change, and it's going to start making a lot of people uncomfortable. And to my other point just a little bit ago about the nation building experiment and us imposing our will on other people, that kind of something that's happening as a reaction or is going to be happening here very soon. At the time of recording this, it is January 20th, which is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and also Inauguration Day for President Trump. And one of the things that he is seeking to implement is this Department of Government Efficiency,
Mm-hmm.
headed by persons like Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk. And the purpose of this is to come in and gut the government system as much as they can and cut out waste, fraud, and abuse.
As they should.
There is an overwhelming amount of it happening. And as a result of a lot of this waste, fraud, and abuse, there are a lot of people doing things for the sake of maintaining their job. The FBI. But there's a lot of other sub bureaus and interdepartmental bureaus and a whole bunch of crap that exists for the sake of existing to keep itself existing now.
Yeah.
That it may have served a purpose when it was initiated, but it is that purpose has since been fulfilled, and these people don't want to give up their jobs because it's a nice cushy job in a lot of cases, and so they implement regulation and find these things and do these things so that way they can maintain their position.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people that, one, just don't have an understanding of the point of this and don't understand how bad the system is in government. For a couple of for a couple of examples, who's that guy? Oh, the Mark Anderson gentleman that I talked about earlier on Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
He's a tech guy in a tech company. Has had several tech companies actually, and he's one of the main guys for Substack. And he's got some AI stuff that he's working on. Some of the stuff that he talked about, I know how bad government is. I know how bad the policies and regulations are, and I have no idea how bad it was. And the same thing, there's a gentleman on, again, Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson. Let me see if I can pull up his name real quick. His name is Brigham Bueller, I think, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he's talking about the healthcare industry and pharmaceutical industry, like everything encapsulated within the medical industrial complex, if you will.
Yeah.
And again, I work on the fringes of it. So my current job, if you want to look at it from the perspective of Star Wars, is kind of like Tatooine. It's in the Outer Rim.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of Imperial influence out there, but it's not direct.
It's mostly controlled by gangsters.
Yeah. Well, it's on the fringes, is my point.
Yeah, I know.
So I have this semi outsider view, and I get to see and deal with a lot of the same things that doctors and others get to deal with the insurance agencies and whatnot. And I know how bad it is. And I had no idea how bad it is. It's like when Bilbo was trying to just discuss how much and how little he knows about Gandalf. I forgot where I was coming from. Where I started that.
Working toward the.
Oh, Doge. Oops. And again, a lot of people are coming from a place of ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times willful ignorance because that's the other team and I'm against them.
Yes. I see a lot of that.
And they're not willing to see. And the point of that was just like these changes that are going to be imposed that a lot of people are afraid of and how relevant that is to today from this movie. These things being imposed on other people. Beautifully done. Do you have anything else?
I have nothing.
All right. Well, I think we finally fished all the fishable spots of this pond, and
now it's time to drain it so we can go water the fields.
Yeah. And I'm gonna reiterate this. Mostly I've done this for myself. I still stand by this as a pond that thinks it's bigger than it is. And just because nobody else has fished this pond this well, and I've been able to get a lot of productivity out of it, doesn't mean it's not a pond.
Yeah.
So, thank you for listening. Bye.
Bye.